I think people would like the government to do much more than just telling them to eat bitterness and work hard and not make a fuss. I think the Communist Party's legitimacy is undermined to some extent, but not enough to throw the party, to overthrow the party. I think there was a general assumption that the party and state in China were managing society quite well and successfully, and Chinese people were benefiting from that. And now I think it's likely that, if there's some new campaign or some new, whatever, people are much more likely to be skeptical or even critical. Some of these things, like Xi Jinping's claim that he's going to find ways to have women to have more babies, that's clearly creating derision in China. Young people and women in particular, I think this is absurd. This Xi Jinping he's completely out of touch with reality. What does he think he's doing? The society that we're living under does not produce a situation in which it makes sense to have 3 babies for most people. So I think the legitimacy is not, you either have it or you don't. So there's more legitimacy or less. And I think the party, I would say, in Xi Jinping's leadership has less legitimacy now just because of the mishandling and the brutal experience people had at the end of the COVID epidemic in China, but also other things. I mean, even things like, the housing sector, the problems with the housing sector now. I mean, partly because of for many years, it seemed to be a central source of dynamism and improved family incomes and everything. But the result of that is that China produced incentives for local governments and developers to build a lot more housing than was actually needed. And then with the population shrinking, So where is the competence of the party state in allowing that to happen? Even you can, I would say, you can look at the higher education in China. And this predates Xi Jinping. Under Jiang Zemin, China decided to have this very dramatic expansion of college enrollments, and assuming so it wasn't driven by markets, it was driven by the party officials deciding, well, we're going to need a lot more highly educated people in the future, so let's quickly expand and so forth. So, but one of the problems now is that China is producing many more college graduates, and including from these 3rd and 4th rank newer universities that were rapidly set up that are not such high quality and so forth. So there are many more young people who are graduating with college degrees who are having trouble finding a job. So the youth unemployment problem, a lot of it is focused on, the fact that China has more people who thought they were going to find a route to secure well-paying and, productive jobs and are now having trouble doing that. I don't have any ability to, penetrate into Xi Jinping's brain and see what's motivating him. But it has always struck me that he in particular, but also some earlier leaders like Jiang Zemin and his reaction to the Falun Gong cult and everything like that, that there's a paranoia about loss of control. I don't think was warranted when Xi Jinping came to power. In other words, I think people were, were quite accepting and positive and willing to, innovate and invest and so forth. And that was very different than the situation in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had endured in its final years a considerable amount of economic as well as political stagnation and so forth. China was still, even though the economic growth rate had slowed some, but nonetheless, it was still booming ahead, and people, more and more people getting educated, more and more Chinese tourists traveling abroad. I had my last sabbatical from Harvard in 2013 and was very fortunate to spend it in Florence, Italy. And remember, I kept running into Chinese tourists. You know, my wife and I, early in that trip, we were sitting in restaurants, and she also speaks some Chinese, and we struck up a conversation with the young Chinese sitting at the table next to us, and said, you know, what, they're from Shanghai, and they work for the police in Shanghai. My wife has no desire to buy fancy leather purses that cost thousands of dollars, but Chinese tourists were lining up to buy these things, and I think Xi Jinping should have had much more confidence. It may be obvious I'm not a big fan of Xi Jinping, but I think that many of the things that he's been doing to try to strengthen control and emphasize security are going to end up being counterproductive. The idea that you can have all these crackdowns and tightening of controls and getting people in political trouble and you know, scaring intellectuals and so forth. The idea that you can do that without harming your society's ability to, you know, to advance. And I haven't traveled to China since the summer of 2019, so before COVID, and I have nothing immediately planned. But I was at a conference in Beijing run by the Academy of Social Sciences, and a young woman was assigned to escort me around, and I, you know, and I mentioned to her some article that had recently appeared in The Economist magazine, and she said, well, I wish I could read that. But, you know, I mean, now, obviously, Chinese are very clever people, with many of them with VPNs. They can jump over the Great Firewall or whatever, but get access to a lot of things. But nonetheless, the idea that you go back to trying to totally control what people can think and what they can do and so forth without harming China's ability to compete with other societies and to continue growing, it seems to me very problematic. I think that would be a stretch. I you know, I think people are more pessimistic, but there still are lots more areas of dynamism in the Chinese economy than there was in the old Soviet Union. And the old Soviet Union was still very much a state-planned, bureaucratically rigid economy. And China, of course, has a much more vibrant private sector. It's much more involved in the world economy and so forth. And so I don't see that as, you know, as that close, but it's still, you know, I mean, one general issue still has to do with the fact that the most dynamic parts of the Chinese economy remain the private sector and the foreign invested sector, and Xi Jinping keeps wanting to shift the balance, or he claims he supports the private sector. He claims he wants to encourage foreign investment and so forth, but nonetheless, he's clearly emphasized the remaining state-connected industries and so forth. I don't see the economic situation as dire and as, you know, bureaucratically stalled as in the Soviet Union, but I think nonetheless it could be much better if Xi Jinping were not so, you know, we're not so biased and focused on trying to control things and not so scared about China following the path of the Soviet Union and falling apart. There are occasional rumors that people are upset about him and some of his initiatives and so on, but he does a very good job of trying to keep himself at the very center and prevent rivalries from breaking out and so forth. I don't see much chance for protests from below to threaten the system itself. And but again, I could be wrong. You know, I didn't in 1989. I didn't see how close those protests came to really shaking the party's control. So who knows? But things are very different than they were in 1989. You know, Xi Jinping has invested so much more in building up the security systems and control structures and, you know, video surveillance and, everything else. So it's hard for me to imagine that that the change could be generated from below that would change the system.
国内的在野党国民党似乎处处都在配合中共哦，即使发生这样的一个国际局